So, hello everyone. I'm Dr. Richa Shukla. I'm a philosopher. Me and Mansi Rathod, we are going to. This is the first episode where we would be talking about the gendered philosophical voices in the Indian philosophical domain. And who else to begin this than Dr. Bindu Puri? I don't think she needs any introduction. The kind of contemporary Indian philosophical work she has been doing, the kind of contribution she has been making in the Indian philosophical domain, it's all out in the open. Each year, the kind of books which ma'am has been publishing, whether it's on Tagore, whether it's on Gandhi, it keeps on she keeps on coming with some breakthrough arguments which can help us to maneuver everyday life, our mundane lived reality. So the purpose of this CWPI interview series is something which has been started by Mansi and myself. We have the purpose is to talk to women philosophers, if ever they would like to have this tag, or gendered philosophical voices in the Indian philosophical domain, who could just have a lively chat with us in terms of how do they perceive philosophy in the contemporary time, especially during the pandemic when everybody has been going back to philosophy, whether it's in terms of ethics, morality, stoicism, for instance, or whether the intricacies of our lived reality, where philosophy is getting a reborn kind of thing again and again. So, with these words, I really am very thankful to Dr. Bindu Puri, and I welcome her. That despite of her busy schedule, both of us have been chasing her for this interview, but finally she was very kind enough to give us a slot. So, thank you so much, ma'am, for taking out time and doing this interview with us. It would be a short, crisp, nice dialogue which you'll like.
Yeah,
So,
absolutely, absolutely. And thank you so much, Richa, for a wonderful introduction.
glad, ma'am. So, ma'am, just to begin with, what do you think? Someone who did her graduation from St. Stephen's, now you're teaching at the Center for Philosophy. You have also been the chairperson at the Center for Philosophy before. But what made you choose philosophy? Why did you choose philosophy? Or has philosophy chosen you?
No, no, no. I think I definitely chose philosophy because one, I've come from a family of scholars, and also both my parents are philosophers, and my father is, of course, a very eminent philosopher. And I grew up, frankly, uh, always, sort of reading. Uh, I mean, I literally grew up to Plato's dialogues, and so it was a family where a whole lot of discussions of uh, philosophers used to be like literally the dining table conversation. So I grew up with a whole lot of curiosity, and I would say interest, of intellectual interest in philosophy. So definitely I chose philosophy, and it was a wonderful and rewarding journey. And to begin with, I did in my MPhil, actually, I worked with Professor Nirmal Anshu Mukherjee, and I worked in philosophy of language. And then gradually, I became very interested in Indian philosophy. And uh, I did my PhD on Gandhi. I've been literally going walking with Gandhi from the 1900s, reading so much of Gandhi, and very fascinating figure. So I got very attracted to Indian philosophy. And as you know, you can't read Gandhi without knowing classical Indian philosophy because he's so deeply in continuity with that tradition. So I think I was always very fascinated with philosophy and with the philosophical method, with how do you do philosophy. Even today, many times when I write something, my father will tell me, oh, but this is not how you do philosophy. So it's something that you're continuously discovering. And sometimes I get very agitated when he tells me that. So I think, yeah, I would say that definitely I chose philosophy.
That's great, Dr. Bindu Puri. Something that you just mentioned, and that's so critical for us as young philosophers as well to understand, and for people who ask us as well, what does it really mean to do philosophy, like you just mentioned? What is the practice of philosophy, or what is the doing, the verb action of how do we practice being a philosopher in today's time? So any your thoughts on that? What would you, apart from just being an intellectual or having scholarly articles, is there anything else that can be added towards that idea of doing philosophy?
See, of course, to be a philosopher and to be part of, let us say, the academy as a teacher. So, in that sense, to be a philosopher means to have a lot of understanding of the history of philosophy, whether Western or Indian. And I'm not one who thinks that if you do Indian philosophy, you can do it in a philosophical vacuum, so to speak. I think it's very, very important to be very firmly entrenched in the tradition. And therefore, for instance, I'm now doing a book on the Gandhi Ambedkar debate, and a lot of, let us say, arguments that I have made are because I am very comfortable in the Western philosophical tradition and the work of people like Locke and Descartes and Kant. And so, I can look, for instance, at the making of modern identity in the Western world. I can sort of go back to Charles Taylor, I can go back to Murdoch, and then I can use arguments like that to situate my understanding, for instance, of Baba Sahib Ambedkar and how does he think about the self. So the point is, I do not think you do, for instance, Indian philosophy in a vacuum. Now, what about, so when you are doing philosophy as a teacher in the academy, so to speak, you definitely, one aspect to what you're doing is that you must be very well entrenched in all these philosophical traditions and familiarize people whom you are teaching. So I'm currently in JNU, I'm teaching a course on nationalism, Gandhi and Tagore, but we've begun with Anderson's Imagined Community. So there's a lot of, when you're teaching, you got to bring in all these traditions to the problem that you're raising in your course. So that's one aspect of being a teacher in the academy and being a part of, let's say, a philosophy department or center. The other aspect is, of course, as a researcher. What does it mean to be a philosopher? What does it mean to do philosophy? Well, to be curious to begin with, to have a problem, to be able to frame a problem, and then to be able to have a certain sort of, let us say, method, a philosophical method, an ability to raise a problem, an ability to put, first of all, to think about what you want to say about the problem, to be able to frame and construct arguments whereby you can share your insights with the person who is sort of either listening to you or reading you. And I think the third thing, which is very important, is to be able to wield language in a way. For instance, if you look at Bernard Williams, he wields language so beautifully that it is absolutely fabulous just to read him, because the way he thinks and the way he puts it across are so much in sync and harmony. So I think part of being a philosopher is to be able to wield language to put what you want to say. In the minimum of words, but yet very clearly. And in that sense, for instance, I think Professor Miri, my father, does that very beautifully. There's never a word out of place. And I think I still have too many words. So it's very, that is part of the philosophical method, which is why you see when you're training students, you make them do a lot of term papers, because many times what they want to say, first of all, people are not clear what is the problem that they are addressing. Secondly, they do not really bring out their own arguments or insights about what is it that they see and what is it that they want to say about what they see. And thirdly, they are not able to wield language, let's say, sharply enough to convey all these things. So all this is involved in being a philosopher.
Thank you, ma'am. Just taking cue from something which you said. Actually, my next question has two parts. You mentioned thinkers and philosophers like Murdoch, John Locke. So I wanted to ask you that while growing up, while trying to bend or have a philosophical bend of mind, were there any specific gendered philosophical voices which weren't the mainstream voices? That okay, Plato, Locke, that you think that when you read them you thought that wow, this is something interesting and I never thought that this can be perceived as a philosophical voice. And just taking ahead from that, because you also mentioned something very interesting when you were talking about when we train people how to be a philosopher or just cultivate a problem. So just to coming to that, do you think that there is a gender gap in philosophy? uh, I would not use the term marginalization. Maybe that might be too harsh, or that might be a very strong word to use. But in the contemporary Indian philosophical domain, or in general, do you see a gender gap? And if you see, then what do you think? What's the reason? Because you are someone who have been the chairperson, you are someone who has been on multiple committees. So, do you see that there is any truth to this kind of premise which many people are trying to establish? That it is philosophy is the mother of all disciplines, but then why it's motherless in nature, if it is.
See, this question has two aspects. One is philosophy in the academic. Secondly is administrative positions for women. See, I have been involved both in the practice of philosophy as a teacher and a researcher, and also I have occupied a lot of administrative positions, very many number of administrative positions, including chairing a governing body of a college in Delhi University. So there are two aspects to the question. Now let's look at the first. Are there women philosophers? Are women voices present in philosophy? Of course, there are people like Martha Nussbaum, Iris Murdoch, wonderful book, Sovereignty of the Good, I've just been reading. And of course, the whole domain of care ethics and a lot of women scholars, all in every branch, in every aspect of philosophy, there are wonderful contributions by women who are absolutely. And if you look at the Indian tradition, actually, I did for the external services of the All India Radio for a long time a series on women philosophers in India, and looking at famous dialogues like that between Yagnavalkya and Gargi. So I actually did that, and there are also all these women scholars in the Jain sutras, which one hasn't kind of looked at. So I think it's not that women are not present, it's maybe that we haven't really looked seriously at a lot of Indian women voices in let's say in Indian philosophy, classical Indian philosophy. Many people have not looked at Indian philosophy. So where people are, the Indian philosophy has been so neglected by the university system, and so the question of where are the women voices, first of all, will be made when there is a space for doing Indian philosophy. So we don't really have schools of Indian philosophy. For instance, I would think it's very important for us to have schools of language and philosophy where a student can come in, do Pali, do Sanskrit, and then do classical Indian philosophy and classical Buddhist philosophy, because we have both the shamanic and the Brahmanic traditions of Indian philosophy. And a student should be able to get into a school, learn Pali, learn Sanskrit, do classical Indian philosophy. There is so much that is such a wonderful, rich tradition over there at so many layers. So I think then the space for reading the work of or the dialogues with classical Indian philosophers, women philosophers in India, some space will emerge over there. So it's not that these voices are not there. It's just that we are neglecting classical Indian philosophy. Therefore, we do not hear the women's voices. Now, coming to the administrative aspect of the question, what about the university system? Because we are doing philosophy through the system. And where is the space for women in administration? Now, I will say that yes, first of all, there is a glass ceiling here like everywhere else. People are very happy to have women in supporting structures, but to have women occupying higher positions is very, very, still you find a huge amount of resistance. And it's not just me saying this, you can just have a look, just have a look at how many women are vice chancellors in the Indian university system. And has the UGC had a woman chairman? And how many people, how many women are occupying really high positions in administrative frameworks in India? How many women are, for instance, chairing the university colleges in Delhi University? You will find there are very few women who are able to occupy these higher positions. And there is definitely a need to break through. Now, let me say, why do I think it's necessary? I don't think it's necessary just to make a political point. Let's say if we look at the politics of the feminist movement, I do not think that that is really the reason why women should be up there to make a kind of a symbolic gesture for women. I think that there is a need because half, more than half the students who are studying in the university or college system are women. So sometimes I feel that women can be more sensitive to gendered presences in the university system than maybe men can. So if we have higher, positions which are equally divided between men and women, you will have a let's say, sensitization of the workplace to women as occupying positions of faculty members and administrative roles. And secondly, there will be more, sort of sensitization to women students and to their needs. For instance, if you look, a lot of difficulties that women students face, let's say in the university system, is because there are not enough women in a higher position. Okay, so that's really what I would say. So I think it's very important. Even things, very simple things like bathrooms. If you see that, why do women students need to access bathrooms? Why do women faculty need to access bathrooms? There are some specific reasons for women to have, for instance, dustbins in bathrooms. Now, if you go to any typical university in India, you will not find a sensitization to that kind of very particularly feminine need reflected in the construction of these bathrooms. Now, I will say that we always talk, we talk, right, from, let's say, a politics of the feminist movement when we look at this issue, but we don't look at what the ground realities are and why we might need women in higher positions to be able to reconstruct these spaces to become more women friendly. So that's why. So there are two aspects, like I said, to that question, which I've tried to answer.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Puri. And as you were mentioning in this response as well, that yes, even the Indian philosophical tradition has been neglected over the years. There are again two parts to the follow-up question I have. One being that, do you agree that we still have a whitewashed sense of education in India? White supremacy still being a reality within the Indian educational context. And then further on, what role do you think these religious or traditional practices, what role do you think they can play in making knowledge claims and thereby contributing towards the development of Indian philosophical thought?
Let me take the
For
first one. I will say that I have lectured extensively in universities outside India, and one thing I have found is that if you, for instance, go to a philosophy of religion conference outside of India, there is a lot of sensitization in that discourse to the need to reconstruct syllabi in philosophy of religion to reflect categories and concepts which come from outside the mainstream, let us say, religions in the western part of the globe. So you will find a whole lot of curiosity, for instance, in philosophy of religion conferences which are held in the West. about traditions outside of the Western world. So they are interested in Chinese, classical Chinese thought. They are interested in, let's say Jain thought. They are interested in Buddhist thought. They are interested in Hindu thought. But you will find that there is so little of scholarly work in these areas which can be accessed by people teaching philosophy of religion in the Western departments, that it becomes very difficult for them to construct, rethink syllabi, and have texts which they can sort of make available to everybody.
Yeah.
So I think, I will go back to K.C. Bhattacharya's article on Swaraj in ideas. It's not just important for Indian, philosophy, Indian philosophers to kind of reiterate, what has been done, or for us to contribute to discussions on in Western philosophy, but it's important for us to engage with problems in Indian philosophy in a manner that is not a philosophical vacuum. For instance, look at Casey's own work on Kant and bring a distinctively Indian perspective to bear on those problems, and also to do work in your own traditions, so that that work can then be accessible to other people while framing syllabi. So I think it's very, very important for us to do Indian philosophy, but do it in the light of problems that have been of interest all over the world, and bring those texts to bear. And I also think it's important for mainstream philosophical departments to have approaches to Indian philosophy reflected in syllabus, which you do not find. It's, you have a tokenism over there. Like you have a tokenism, kind of to women. It's a tokenism. So, oh, we have to have an Indian component. So let's just put in one text willy-nilly. There's no rethinking of syllabi to reflect the Indian philosophical tradition. And I've actually found a lot of people, when I started doing Indian philosophy, telling me, oh, this is not philosophy at all. What are you doing? This is like the history of India. So this is really how people have approached Indian philosophy when I started doing Indian philosophy. So I think it's a lot better, but it also, we really, it's not just Indian philosophy, it's also African philosophy, it's also Chinese philosophy. There is a whole lot of, marginal, and Richa herself worked on Kashmiri voices, right? So there is a lot of marginalization that happens, and you find that the whole mainstream structure just looks at a certain kind of thinking, and there is a lot of marginalization happening to other traditions. I would put others within single inverted commas. So that's regards the first part. Sorry, what was the second part of the question?
Yes, sorry. So the second part of the question was, as you mentioned, the need to be entrenched in philosophical traditions, the history of those traditions. With respect to the Indian context, then, for instance, ancient religious practices or traditions, what role can these customs or traditions can they play in the development of the Indian philosophical thought?
No, I think, you do not, if there is any sphere which is free, in a certain sense, I would say from, or rather should be free from the politics, should actually be the practice or the engagement with ideas in the academia. Obviously, the university system has never been, has not really ever been free of uh, the politics of ideologies. And we know there's a reason for that. The reason is the university system is about freedom. So there's a whole lot of politics of ideologies in the university system. But what I would say is that the world of ideas is a space where we can all, in that sense, of course, I mean, if you, for instance, look at history, history is a measure to approach the past. And then you see there are so many ways of, so many different measures which the historian as juror can take. So, for instance, you can have a Marxist history, you can have an Islamic history, you can have a Hindu history. But the point of being an academic is to be self-conscious about what you're doing. And so if, for instance, I'm choosing a measure as a, let's say, as a woman, then I need to be conscious that I'm looking at the past through the measure of a feminist lens, and that there are these other ways also out there. And so that's part of being an academic, that you're self-conscious about what you're doing, right? So I would say that yes, that certainly you do not need religious practices can't contribute anything to doing Indian philosophy. But certainly you can locate those religious practices within a tradition and make sense of why they are what they are, and what kind of role do these practices play in the life of the believer. So, for instance, very interesting how Roger Scruton tells you that what is the role of the sacred. So the sacred, he says, look, the sacred is in a sense mediating between your world and the world out there. So that's really what the sacred is. And if you try to bring that sacred down and naturalize it, then it's no longer the sacred. So you're kind of then completely desecrating the notion of the sacred. So as a philosopher, I can understand the role of the sacred. I know how it functions, okay, and I know what kind of role it plays. But I don't need to kind of take a position about the sacred to be able to do philosophy about religion, right? So philosophers can contribute to an understanding of the religious domain, but they do not need the crutch of an ideology of any kind, whether religious or non-religious, to be able to engage in philosophy. I think philosophers really need, I just gave you the example of history. I think you have to be self-conscious when you let ideology come into what you're doing.
So, ma'am, just to take from something which you just mentioned about reflection and philosophical vacuum, it could be considered and dismissed by, because philosophers have long also been dismissing this criticism, because throughout, whether it's the intersectionality, which now has taken a well-versed shape in our classes as well. But what I wanted to know is, do you think that this criticism of philosophers being considered as ivory intellectuals, they are armchair intellectuals, they're sitting in some ivory tower, they do some abstract thinking, and they are talking about society, but still they don't want to get into society. And like something which my friends who are political scientists and sociologists always keeps on talking, that come on, you people are the most intellectually snobbish people I've met. You guys are talking about everything, but you guys don't believe in presenting data, you guys don't believe in field work. And my response is, see, this world is my field work, what do you want me to do? So I mean, just talking about philosophical vacuum, do you think that we as philosophical community, have we not been taking criticism or thoughts like this very seriously? Are we actually someone who are armchair intellectuals? And just to take away from that and just to include gender into this perspective, ma'am, do you think that uh, is that also a reason that there has been a distrust between women's voices and philosophical lineage in the philosophical domain?
Okay, so again, there are two aspects to your question. I'll begin with the first one. When you were speaking about the armchair philosopher, I was reminded of Isaiah Berlin. And there's this beautiful thought from Berlin, which I find very interesting. He says, look, people think that philosophy is something which is undergone, in an armchair style, for instance, by the dons at Oxford and Cambridge in their wonderful studies, and it has nothing to do with the rest of the world. But he points out, look, how much of, you know, Berlin has done a lot of history of philosophy. And he says, look, how much of what the world has become is really influenced by what philosophers thought and did. And you see that particularly in the domain of political philosophy. You find, for instance, the whole idea of the nation with people like Herder talking about what the nation was, the idea of the woke, the idea of linguistic cultural nationalism, and how did it go on to shape the way the world became, the way for instance, how could people imagine themselves together as a community because of people like Herder who put it out there, right? So a lot of what the world becomes is really wha- because of what philosophers thought about how things are playing out. Now, for instance, now look at the making of modern identity, and you look at how modern identity was made. Now, there's this beautiful book by Taylor on the sources of the modern self, and you see how, notions like what is, what do we think, what does the modern self think about her own identity or his own identity. There is a three aspects to it. There is an inwardness, there is an there is a individualism, there is an concentration with ordinary life. There is a whole lot of emphasis on expressivism, right? So you see how different our notion of ourself is from ancient kind of notions of the self, where notions of the self were really bounded to the notion of the community and to the whole wider world out there. Witness the concept of Rit in the Indian tradition, witness the concept of dharma as foundation, and how the notion of dharma, the individual dharma, is tied up with dharma of society through the etymology of the word dharma as foundation. So there, what I'm trying to say is the way ideas work and the way we think about ourselves is so intimately connected, but we are not self-conscious of it. So when I ask you, who are you? And you give a very individualistic answer in terms of modern notions of the self, you do not know that you owe to us 2 centuries of liberal philosophy in the West, that Locke's rejection of innate ideas probably had a lot to do with the inwardness of how you think about yourself as the source of all value, how you think that you don't need to have someone tell you what is of value, but that you yourself from within know what is of value. So, what does Locke and Kant have to contribute to that? A lot. Only we need not be self conscious of how that happened. How many centuries of philosophy went into that? So, that's very, very important. Now, so I think philosophy actually has a lot to do with the practical world. Only we are not very conscious of what it had to do with it. It requires, somebody to unpack. That'll take me like 45 minutes to unpack what our identity has to do with, philosophy, and how ancient and modern concepts of the self came into conflict in India in the post-colonial world. And so that's very important. Now, what about gendered spaces? You see all Anit Baer and various other scholars telling you how notions of ethics came to be dominated by male paradigms through the work of people like Kant, who considered rationality in a certain, who kind of framed the idea of rationality in a certain way, a way in which women could not see their own ways of thinking to be kind of reflected. And therefore, they came up with this whole domain where their ethics of care moved with more feminine paradigms of reasoning, right? So, yeah, there is, so you, that shows you how practical philosophy is. The ways in which you, for instance, define rationality have a lot to do with what you think, is rational for people to do. So this, how do you define rationality? So this wonderful book by Alasdair MacIntyre in 1988, where he talks about the fact that liberal philosophy, for instance, thinks that they've had the last word to say on justice and rationality. But there are, both these terms are tradition constituted and tradition constitutive terms. And there can be alternative concepts of justice and alternative rationalities. And that's very important. So philosophy is actually very, very practical, but we're not self-conscious about how practical it is.
Sure.
So I think I've
Yeah,
answered those.
completely agree with that. Especially with disciplines and fields like, for instance, now philosophy itself also borrows approaches and methods, for instance, like anthropological approaches or the philosophy of science, philosophy of religion. So there are various practical aspects towards just understanding philosophy in the abstract sense, I believe, as well. So I think, Dr. Puri, we're nearing the end of our session as well. Just towards as a last concluding thought, what would be your advice to young researchers and philosophers who wish to come up into this field of philosophy? And any thoughts for them, for instance, like how you mentioned how it's relevant to not practice philosophy in a vacuum or a silos, right? And the how we've also kind of addressed that there is a certain lack of representation or access to resources and materials as well. So kind of wrapping up on those thoughts as well, what could be your two piece advice for young researchers and philosophers?
My advice, one is that you must read a lot. And I don't buy this, there are no resources at all. Because, I myself very often just go on Google and JSTOR and find things and read them. There's so much out there. And, there's always things that you can read. And even if, so I find it very strange when people tell me, I don't know how, it's my father who is been in this profession for so long is the one who's always telling me, have you read this? This is just, have you read this book? This is just come. And there are, there are so much. I mean, I'm always happy to read Plato, always, for the 100th time. And I see something new in it. And same with Bernard Williams or Roger Scruton. There's always, there is Iris Murdoch. I don't know how many times I've read The Sovereignty of the Good. And it always speaks anew to me. And so there's, first thing I'll say is please read and just keep reading. One thing I miss in my life is time to read. So, for instance, I'm very bad with answering the phone or messages now. When I'm reading and writing, I just switch them off and I forget they exist. Second thing is to write. Write a lot. Keep writing. Don't be shy of writing. And people are so against doing their exams or doing term papers. I find that so ridiculous. The teacher is very happy if they're not doing it because it's just less work for her or him. They are most lazy about it. But it's so wonderful to keep writing because the more you write, the more you learn to write. So, even when I'm right now, currently in the process of finalizing a book for Springer, and when I edit it, I keep delaying the manuscript because every time I read it, I think I can put it across better. So it's very important to write, keep writing, keep reading, keep engaging, and do not let all this sound revolution and all these byte revolutions from the, internet and from the media distract you from your work. There's always things out there. There are malls and there's shopping and there's internet, but there's a lot within which you can unpack, which is wondrous and beautiful. So go ahead and unpack all that first and then open up all the packets.
Yeah, thank you so much,
So I think that's
Dr. Puri. Yeah, I think definitely reading, of course, and writing as a skill. I think it's so crucial for us because it's a process of thinking. While writing, one also learns how to think while writing, right?
yeah, and I
So
would
I
recommend
believe as well
one thing I'd like to say, I would
to, yeah,
recommend to all women
yeah,
to read Kautilya's Arthashastra. Because,
yeah,
I mean, if you read that text, you will disabuse yourself of the notion that the Indian tradition was not friendly to women. Because I think it's one of the most woman friendly texts I have ever read from that period. He talks about
yeah.
women, pregnant women getting all kinds of concessions in
Correct.
like ferries and so on. He talks about the right of a woman to divorce. He talks about a woman's, I mean, he has a whole lot of wonderful uh, things in place in his theory of state for women. And one of the only crimes which is punishable by death for Kautilya is if somebody attacks a pregnant woman. So, I mean, I would recommend, for instance, everybody go back and read Kautilya's Arthashastra. There is so much to read. Lifetime becomes so less. To me, the main thing is that the day is not long enough and I'm not able to read enough.
I think many of us are so accustomed to the bite-sized information these days that we kind of forget to go back to the original texts or the sources that we have available as well. So
So
thank you so much, Dr. Puri. Yes,
and
and
thanks
it
to
was
both of
great to. It was a great session. Hopefully, we can do this again sometime soon as well. We'll try to collaborate with other philosophers as well, and we can have a probably like a panel or a group discussion as well on a thematic discussion as well. So, sure. Thank you so much, Dr. Puri, and thank you, Richa, as well,
Thank you
for
so much,
connecting
ma'am.
me with
Thank you
Thanks,
so
Dr.
much.
Puri.
Richa. Thank you, Mansi. It was wonderful chatting with you today.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you so very much for thinking of me and
Sure,
inviting me.
sure.
It was a
Thank
big
you.
honor for me to be
Thank
here
you.
at this session. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Okay, bye.
Take care, ma'am.
Okay.
Bye.
Thank you, ma'am.